Good morning. Bon dia. That was for Antonio. Good morning, everybody. I'm Andrew Seeley, President of the Migration Policy Institute. It's my distinct honor to welcome all of you here, and especially to welcome António Vitorino. We are immensely pleased to have him with us here today, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Portugal, the former EU Commissioner for Justice and Home Affairs, and most importantly for today's discussion, the Director General of the International Organization on Migration, UN Migration. And congratulations, I realize you've been in, since October 1st, you have been the Director General, but it's our first time to congratulate you in Washington, and so it really is an honor to have you here with us. Few people know migration issues around the world as well as António Vitorino. He's wrestled with these issues in multiple forms in all of the positions he's held throughout his career, and he arrives particularly well-suited at a very difficult time, at a time when migration has a heightened role in international debates and is increasingly important in solving national and international problems. And he's arriving at a time where IOM is playing a leading role as well within the UN system. And so he arrives at a time where his wisdom is much needed. We're particularly honored that he's chosen MPI to offer his first public remarks in Washington, D.C. on his first official trip here. He's a longtime member of MPI's Transatlantic Council on Migration, and someone we've had the pleasure to work with through many years. Before I pass on to Demetrios Papademetriou, I want to acknowledge two of my colleagues, and actually I want to acknowledge the Ambassador of El Salvador, who's joined us as well. Thank you for being here, Madam Ambassador. I want to acknowledge Kathleen Newland, my colleague, Senior Fellow at MPI, who's done a great deal of work on global issues, one of the most respected minds on global migration issues, did a lot of advising recently to help the UN structure how it deals with migration, and has been involved in almost every forum you could imagine, from the Global Forum on Migration and Development to the Global Compact through the years. So Kathleen, thanks for being here. And of course, though he needs no introduction in this group, I will now turn it over to Demetrios Papademetriou, MPI's founder, the President Emeritus of MPI, who will be introducing and leading the discussion with António Vitorino. Demetrios remains with us as a distinguished transatlantic fellow. He's the convener of our Transatlantic Council on Migration, as well as a great source of wisdom and guidance for many of us here in Washington who work on these issues. And Demetrios, great pleasure that you are chairing today's session. So turn over to you.
Thank you. Do I have to do anything? I just talk, right?
I think you're introducing.
I don't know whether I have to push any buttons. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming, and it's so good to see so many faces that we know and have known for a long time, and also many newcomers, because as the generations shift, more and more people enter the field. So, welcome. It is a privilege and an honor for me to say a few words about António Vitorino. You already heard Andrew highlighting some of the things that he has done. What Andrew cannot say is that António has been one of the strongest, most consistent friends of the Migration Policy Institute, and a personal friend of mine. It has been a pleasure. I've always learned from him. The Transatlantic Council here in the United States is a rather amorphous organization because we're a bit parochial about things outside of our country, except for the last 2 or 3 years where we realized that we cannot just live in splendid isolation when it comes to the issues that the Migration Policy Institute studies and writes about and advises governments on. I've always consulted with António before we decide on what we're going to do next in the Transatlantic Council. And it is great to actually realize that, and I have to be careful here, that IOM at this particular juncture, where more and more is asked of it, has the opportunity to be led by someone who knows and lives the issues of international migration. So António, thank you very much for coming, and I will give you the floor. The choreography is that he's going to speak from prepared remarks for about 10 minutes. And then I will open a conversation with him, ask him a couple of questions, but I will constantly be looking at you to see if you have questions that you will, or comments that you would like to make. So, António,
Madam Ambassador, Andrew, Dimitri, dear friends. First, of course, I want to thank you for the invitation. I've known many of you, and particularly you, Dimitri, for many years, through a number of my previous lives. And so it is an honor for me to be here today and to join you as the Director General of the International Organization for Migration. And it is a privilege to take the leadership of this organization at this juncture. IOM's ability to respond on the ground in unfamiliar environments and at speed is one of the organization's most valuable assets. This has been confirmed by those that I have met from within and outside government over the last month since I took this position, and again through my meetings here in Washington, D.C. this week. But being a flexible, decentralized, responsive organization is always also a challenge. Not only is migration today, as you mentioned, a deeply sensitive issue at the top of the political agendas across the world, but the drivers and the dynamics of movements are becoming ever more complex and thus harder to classify in a simple, neat manner. Indeed, the large-scale movements of people, driven by very diverse motivations, have posed a political as well as a humanitarian challenge to the international community. In Southern America, increasing numbers of Venezuelans nationals have moved to neighboring countries, a dynamic that has accelerated in recent months. During 2018, an estimated 5,000 left the country each day. Our estimate that from the 3.4 million Venezuelans who have departed, 2.7 are in neighboring countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. IOM's experience with large-scale movements in recent years has taught the organization a number of key lessons that have been important for us to address the situation in Southern America. First, governments in the region have indeed demonstrated strong solidarity and cooperation, as well as have shown ingenuity in the ways in which they have extended various legal status and support mechanisms to Venezuelan nationals, often with IOM's support. But let's be clear, this solidarity has now been stretched to its limits. As we saw during the early years of the Syrian conflict, and we need to show that we have learned with the past, the absence of strong support from the international community for neighboring host states such as Jordan, Lebanon, or Turkey has reduced the ability of those countries to continue to host large numbers. Therefore, secondary movements to Europe were, in large part, a failure to act early enough with sufficient financial and material support. We should not make that mistake again. Second, the provision of immediate assistance, notably health support, is of course critical. But there is a need to offer broader support to the host communities in the border regions of neighboring states, both for their own citizens as well as Venezuelans. The generous welcome that they have offered to new arrivals should not come at the cost of their own long-term capacity to provide public services to their own citizens, which may in turn generate resentment and xenophobic sentiment. Third lesson, the situation has highlighted the need for and the benefits of close cooperation with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Together, the IOM and UNHCR have appointed Mr. Eduardo Stein as a joint representative for Venezuelan refugees and migrants, and the two agencies are working with regional governments alongside a broader alliance of agencies and civil society and faith-based organizations. I would say we have an operation with more than 100 civil society and government departments involved. UN agencies need to work closely together in these situations to realize greater effectiveness and efficiency in the delivery of international support on the ground. At IOM, we consider the development of strong, coherent partnerships with governments, with UN agencies, and with local actors on the ground essential to realizing our goals, and I will underline the key role to be played by the local authorities in the neighboring areas. But while Southern America region dominates the headlines, it is not the sole area of concern for IOM. Yemen has become one of the most severe humanitarian crises in the world, affecting all populations, including non-nationals. It is an example of the enduring challenges faced by the international community in delivering effective humanitarian action, not least due to the difficulties in getting access to the people in need. In the midst of such crisis, it is easy to miss the fact that more than 7,000 migrants journey across the Red Sea each month to Yemen in order to reach Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, many of whom are subjected to various forms of abuse and exploitation. We assess that last year, roughly 150,000 migrants went to Yemen amidst a very serious conflict and a very severe humanitarian crisis. The plight of Rohingya refugees hosted by Bangladesh in Cox's Bazar continues to be for us a priority. IOM has established a comprehensive response, but planned responses here must contend with an additional complexity. The region is particularly vulnerable to extreme weather, such as early rains, cyclones, and monsoons, and I hope I will visit Cox's Bazar next month to have a better assessment of the situation on the ground. But while IOM is reacting on the ground to these and other regions of concern, I could mention to you Libya, the Sahel, Iraq, or Ethiopia, the organization is also looking ahead to the next decade to identify the key changes that will take place in the world and that will mean for my IOM's work. I want to highlight a couple of these and how we will need to adapt to manage them effectively. First, the relationship between mobility and development outcomes is complex and deeply dependent on context. Economic growth, indeed, may motivate individuals to move just as the absence of livelihood opportunities can push them to emigrate. The two things might happen, and they might happen simultaneously. But still more people lack the means to move, even when circumstances become dire. IOM is one of the agencies with the widest reach with respect to internally displaced populations in terms of both operational scope and financial resources, and it is a population that we see increasing in number. As well as it is increasing in number, the populations that are displaced because of natural disasters, environmental degradation, or climate change. The impact that environmental change will have on migration dynamics over the next decade, when combined with growing intercontinental demographic disparity, widening economic and social inequality, and unresolved instability, are a plethora of drivers for migration that we need to take into consideration. That's why for us, IOM, it is extremely important to go on collecting data, reflecting on the realities on the ground, benefiting from the nature of a very decentralized organization. And at the same time, using technology and the advancements in artificial intelligence and big data collection to try to anticipate the trends of evolution of migratory movements. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, for all the controversy of the last months surrounding the Global Compact on safe, regular and order migration, I believe, trying to see the positive side, that the conversation between states has developed substantially. Issues that were once taboo are taboo, and regions are learning to collaborate in pursuit of mutual interests. IOM wants to play a role of honest broker in these discussions and will continue to work to bring in the voices of non-state actors, notably those from civil society, the academy or the think tanks. For IOM, we believe that we need to become ourselves a learning organization. We will need to be capable to bringing together our deep knowledge and our experience in order to identify new issues and share new ideas. And in this regard, I look forward to continuing discussions with researchers and think tanks, such as MPI, so that we can ensure that the responses of the international community to migration remain based in fact, not fiction.
So, I think that in a very short presentation, we heard really the kinds of fundamental thinking that IOM, the highest echelons and under the direction of António Vitorino, have been doing. It builds on what IOM has always done, and particularly the things that it has done well, but it goes beyond that to really ask for working closely with all sorts of interested parties, as it were, the NGO sector, think tanks, researchers, and all that. This way, the community of people who are working this field can become an asset to the organization and vice versa. I was supposed to make some announcements in the beginning, but I always,
as usual,
but Lisa always yells at me at the end because I didn't do them. So this session is taped. Let me see if I can read all this. It's been recorded. Questioners' remarks will appear publicly. What I would like you very much to do is when you ask a question, identify who you are, ask the question, and then I may repeat part of the question. This way it is part of the record. So understand that both the questions and the answers will be part of the record of this event. Lisa, did I do it right? Thank you. Antonio, I'd like to ask you a question that goes to what it is that you talked about last, which is about the Global Compact. And if, I'd like you to really talk a little bit about the opportunity and the challenges that the Global Compact presents, and particularly on the challenges. What is it about the Compact that made whatever 20 or 30 countries not to support it. I know that everybody has, sort of theories about it, etc., etc. We probably have a good sense as to why the United States did not support it. And certainly there was a wave of countries the last few days before Marrakesh that sort of pulled out and never signed on to the Global Compact. Would you care to expand on some of this?
Thank you, Demetrios. Well, I think that the reasons why quite a number of countries have not subscribed to the Global Compact are quite different from one case to the other. So I would not dare to say that there is a common pattern of rejection of the Global Compact. In some cases, the arguments were purely fictional. On other cases, they are basically issues of internal politics that played a role. In some cases, I think that the ones who looked at the Global Compact as a milestone of international cooperation in the migration field were unable to dismantle the fake versions of the Global Compact and to build a positive counter-narrative about the Global Compact. But that's the past. Now we have 150-something countries that have subscribed to the Global Compact, 20-something that did not subscribe to the Global Compact, and in IOM's perspective, we will work with all of our member states, irrespective whether they are in the Global Compact or outside the Global Compact. The main difference is that the Global Compact is the implementation of the Global Compact in its own terms. It's a state-led process. So there is no central authority, quote unquote, that will determine which of the 23 objectives are going to be implemented first, second, and third.
So you're not going, IOM is not going to tell the United States what
Not
to
at
do
all.
about this.
It's volunteer, non-legally binding. The countries who have acceded to the Global Compact will pick up their objectives, which is more challenging for IOM because we need to be prepared to support the choices of the member states. And the choices will be asymmetric, let's be clear. From the 23 objectives, some countries will pick up some of them, others will pick up different objectives. But anyway, the point is that the biggest contribution of the Global Compact, I believe, is to demonstrate that the challenges of migratory movements cannot be tackled by a country alone. There is badly need international cooperation. We can disagree or we can find different ways of promoting international cooperation, of course. And the Global Compact is not the quintessence of international cooperation. And other forms of international cooperation are possible, and as I said to you, IOM will go on working with all our member states, with a number of them, an important number of them, probably the terms of reference will be the Global Compact. With the others that did not subscribe to the Global Compact, we will go on working with them as we have done in the last 66 years, and the reference will not be the Global Compact, it will be our bilateral relationship with those countries. Most likely, it will be the case of the country where we are in today.
And even those countries that did not sign the contract, I know that, we all know in this room that they will continue to rely on IOM to do many of the things that they don't really want to commit to. And, of course, the Venezuela crisis and the crisis in Central America are prime examples of this. You mentioned sort of challenges, and in the previous conversation that we had, you have focused on climate change. This is not about, climate change, the science or anything like that. Regardless of what we call it, there's certainly going to be more population movements, more migration as a result of climate change. and these movements, the numbers, will continue to increase. And there is no one that disputes that, again, regardless of the argument about climate science and what have you. You already see these. You mentioned, Cox's Bazar and many other places. Are you doing something, I know that you yourself have thought hard about this, but does IOM have the capability to begin to think harder about the next crises that will be either the direct result of or climate change will contribute to? We know all of these crises that you mentioned, from Libya to, Bangladesh, and, from Yemen to Syria. They all have certain characteristics that are highly troubling. The most troubling of them is that they seem never to end. And never is a big word, but many of these crises have been going on for decades now, and they are producing an awful lot of both internally displaced people in very large numbers, but also external, movements, therefore refugees. Countries in the immediate region, of course, have to deal with it in a real way. But other crises that you sort of foresee, in the near to mid-term, 5 years from now, that will not surprise you, and that you can actually begin to prepare for, in the role of IOM as a humanitarian agency?
Well, I think that it's likely to, I believe I can say that the number of displaced people because of environmental degradation and climate change is going to rise. And our assessment today is that there are 40 million internally displaced people, and probably the majority of these are already movements due to climate change. But climate change is a big word. You need to fine-tune what means climate change. Because the impacts of environmental degradation are very different if you consider the Pacific Islands or Sub-Saharan Africa. They can be both considered on equally as climate change, or the Caribbean, for example. But they are very different. You have the rise of the waters of the sea on a number of places, and in some cases the countries will lose parts of their national territory. And that will oblige people to be relocated, and sometimes relocated even in a different country than they live today. That's a very specific problematic on the Pacific Islands. And the IOM works with the UN Special Envoy for least developed, landlocked, and small development islands. I think this is the small islands. Yes, it's a long title. And on the 8th of April, we are going to publish a report on precisely climate change and migration. This report will be focused on the impacts of climate change, above all in the Pacific Ocean. But for instance, we work with FAO in Sub-Saharan Africa, because definitely there what we are seeing is that a number of rural areas are running out of potential of livelihood. We see the movement of rural populations that can no longer live on the agriculture towards the cities. Probably Africa will be the continent where urbanization is going to be the fastest in the world. And these rural populations that for decades have been living in a rural environment, when they arrive to the city, they have to adapt to a totally different setting, to a different way of life, and sometimes they are not welcome. There are tensions, there are crashes, and therefore they move because of environmental degradation, and then they need to find a new place to settle. And we are not talking about small numbers, as I told you. We are talking about big numbers. And we need, IOM is very much focused on establishing the nexus between humanitarian aid, that population needs humanitarian support, but at the same time there is a need to build conditions for those persons to settle in a new place and finding a livelihood there. And I think this is going to be each time more and more frequent and present in the next decade.
Thank you. While you're preparing your questions, let me ask you one more question before I turn it to the floor. In some ways, in this job, you're reprising, the job that you did, whatever it was, from 1999 to 2004, 15 years ago, as EU Commissioner for all of these issues. So, one significant part of your job at the time was trying to work with, African countries and the Maghreb countries in trying to deal or, understand better how collaborative approaches to the issue might work better for both parties, both Europe, of course, and the particular country in question. And has something changed now in the way that some of the African countries, are thinking about the migration relationship as it exists today? An awful lot of this being, unauthorized illegal migration, enormous exploitation, and death, large numbers. We only seem to count the ones that die in the Mediterranean, but your organization has been trying to come up with decent, better numbers about people who die en route. Is this something that you see sort of the possibility of, more light coming and the relationship changing from a purely transactional one, I'll give you $7 million and some technical assistance, and I'll take 3, return migrants back. Has there been a change, and how would you describe it?
Oh, absolutely. Probably the most striking change is that quite often we do not mention it, but if you look to the African continent, more than 70% of the people on the move in Africa move from one African country to another African country. So the dimension of the intra-African movement is much bigger than the dimension, typically the one we mention always, south-north, which means from Africa to the European continent. And what the African agenda on migration has progressed enormously in this last decade. It's amazing. There is a free movement area, okay? Very much inspired with European free movement. Okay, it's not yet totally implemented, it's not. But the fact that the majority of countries, the number of countries required to ratify the convention have done so, it's a very good sign, an encouraging sign that there will be much more mobility inside the African continent. There are countries like Rwanda, for instance, that have abolished all kinds of visa requirements for other African countries. So we need to keep a very close eye on what is happening in Africa. And above all, not being cornered just by the relationship between Africa and Europe. There is an African dimension that is extremely important, and probably not only for labor migration, but also for protection, international protection, refugees. In the relationship between the two borders of the Mediterranean, I think that what has changed is that the northern part has realized, not all, but an important part, has realized that return needs to be followed up by reintegration. And the agenda on reintegration is very closely linked with community stabilization, development policy, creating jobs, but also creating conditions for the populations to live a dignified life, which involves things like the rule of law, good governance, and so on. So it's a complex agenda. But the classical dialogue between returning countries and returnees now, fortunately, has come to another stage where the challenges are much more daring. But we have a number of experience. We, IOM, we have a number of experience of successful stories of reintegration in the countries of origin, to the benefit of the host communities also, not just to the benefit of returnees, but also to the benefit of the host communities. And I think that we feel that from the African side there is interest in pursuing this dialogue and spreading these experiences that are successful and that can correspond to the concerns of the donors from the north and from the recipients from the south.
Am I to understand from what you're saying that perhaps one of the areas in which IOM should be investing more in, particularly in thinking and abstracting out, learning from all of these, this way gradually over time to be particularly helpful to the countries that ask for your assistance in the African continent, or for that matter other parts of the world, that this is something that you hope that IOM will be able to continue to expand and literally offer value to the people who ask for your assistance before things get out of hand.
Absolutely. I think that we speak a lot about the nexus between humanitarian and development, and that's true. It's a very important relationship. Complex, but very important. But I think it is not a bipolar relation. It's a tripolar relation. It's a humanitarian aid. It is definitely development policy, but it is also peace, security, rule of law, good governance. And without this triangle, each part will not go very far. So we need to bring the three together and to have a balanced approach in the three dimensions. And that's what we are doing, and we intend to do in the future each time more and more.
I'd like, please, ma'am, would you please identify yourself and wait for the microphone. There is a microphone that will reach you. It has.
Thank you. Thank you very much for being here and sharing your thoughts with us. I have a question with several parts.
Could you tell us who you are first?
Sorry. Marisa Dino, I'm a retired U.S. diplomat. I worked on refugee issues in Pakistan and in Albania. My question is this: what can you tell us about your meetings that you have had or will have here in Washington? Will you have a meeting at the White House? And what are you asking them, and what do you hope to get back from them?
So the question is, in any possible meeting that you might have at the White House, what would be your message and what you'd be asking?
We have a very extensive cooperation with quite a large number of U.S. partners, both in the State Department, mainly PRM, but also in USA. And during these 3 days, I've gone through all of them. So it's a quite heavy agenda. Basically, from IOM side, is that we continue to be a reliable partner for the US. And from our perspective, the fact that they are not in the Global Compact does not change anything in the cooperation that we develop with them. And we have a number of areas where our cooperation with the US has been increased, has even increased. That's the case of the Venezuela crisis, or the caravans, or more recently also in Yemen. So we are pleased with that cooperation, and we will deepen that cooperation, irrespective of the fact that, as you know, the US is not in the Global Compact.
In other words,
it's a very simple message from my side, you see.
And from the US side, it may be, politically very complex, but in terms of the delivery of what it is that the United States needs from IOM, that doesn't change, Global Compact or not. how we feel about immigration or not. We typically very easily, I was distracted trying to see who is going to speak next, very easily create and continue to develop a relationship that addresses issues of concern to the United States, but abroad, if not necessarily, we can easily separate those things. So I saw Kathleen first. Kathleen, if you just wait for a second. And then the lady in the back, it will be next. And then you will be third. So if I sort of make a mistake, just stand up and yell.
Thank you, Dimitri. I'm Kathleen Newland. I'm a co-founder of MPI and a senior fellow here. Antonio, IOM now has over 170 members. You're present in 150 states. You have more than 60 years of experience in migration. So this body of experience that IOM has amassed geographically and over time is rather diffuse. And I wonder if you can tell us, A, what IOM is now trying to do to capture the lessons of this vast experience, and if any themes are starting to emerge as you think about that.
Great question, Kathleen. The experience that IOM has around the world, I'm sorry, I'm repeating the question because of, whatever, the way that this is organized. Can you really sort of have your lessons that you have actually learned that you can put in bottles perhaps and how you can address some of these issues?
Well, one of the decisions that was taken, by the way, by my predecessor, Bill Swing, and I pursued is to create what we call a policy hub. This policy hub aims to bring together two key elements of our IOM's work. One is data collection. We have two different streams of data, the GMDAC in Berlin and the displacement tracking metric in 56 countries. So we need to make sure that the data are reliable, aligned, available in a timely manner, precisely to guarantee that there is an evidence base for the formulation of the policies. So data is one of the key blocks. But in parallel, we need to improve what we call IOM's knowledge management. That's what I was mentioning in the end of my intervention, saying we need to become a learning organization. Because indeed we have a huge experience and expertise in the house. We have been working for 66 years. I always say that we are sitting in a pot of gold, but we don't touch it. So the idea is to touch the pot of gold, is to use the knowledge and translate the knowledge in policy advice. And that will be the task of the global of the policy hub, which will bring together the data sector with the research sector, and above all the field, because our expertise is above all in the field. And I hope sincerely that in a few months we will have some 2 or 3 pilot projects that we can submit to outside control, quality control, and to say, listen, this is the kind of exercise that we are now going to do. What is your opinion? Is it useful? Is it not useful? Is it reliable? Is it not reliable? And we count with the civil society in general, but most specifically with the academy and with the think tanks to go through the product, the outcome, and give us their assessment of the quality of the product, so that then we can start spreading the work of the policy beyond the pilot phase. So the pilot phase, in my view, will last for the next 6 months.
Thank you. The lady back there.
My question is about Hungary, but with broader implications, of course. So and I'm not necessarily asking in your capacity as part of the IOM, but maybe more to your experience and your expertise in the EU context. We've seen Hungary literally wall itself off and continually violate its non-refoulement obligations. I'm wondering what you think we should do about states that vehemently oppose cooperation and international responsibility sharing, and as a part of that, do you think the Dublin Convention, with its where it tends to burden border states more so than other states, if that's had an effect on what we see happening in the border region of the EU? Thanks.
So Dublin, which of course the EU has been trying to fix now for several years, and I think this commission has given up on this, right? But there's going to be a new commission in October, November, December, or whenever of this year, and that is going to be one of the things that they will have to sort of think again about.
Yeah, I agree with Dimitri. I think that the system, the reform of the asylum system is frozen until the European Parliament elections, which will be on 26th of May. And a lot will depend on the outcome of those elections, the rapport de force coming out of that election. Dublin was thought to function in normal times. It was not thought to function under an enormous situation of pressure. Because the mechanisms of solidarity in normal times will be much easier to implement than in a massive influx. And I think that the risk that exists for the European Union, but here I am entering a minefield. The risk is that the difficulties with Dublin will start putting into question the functioning of the borderless Schengen area, which is definitely one of the features that characterizes the European project. So Dublin is not just Dublin, that's my message.
And the fix, I suspect, will have to be a political fix, not just, this isn't about humanitarian and human rights and all that. It is all about, how politically people can, meaning the Europeans, can sort of create a different understanding and arrangement about internal movement. And, Dublin was invented, as Mr. Vitorino said, a long time ago in the early 90s. And it was intended to actually make countries in the external borders of the EU a bit more responsible about how they were treating people who were coming in, but didn't want to stay in these countries, want to move all to whatever, Germany, the same 2 places, 3 places that everybody seemingly wants to move to in the past 25 or so years. The lady over there.
On? Good morning. My name is Neha Mishra, and I'm with an international NGO called the Solidarity Center. I have 2 quick questions. The first one, and I talk too fast, so I'll slow it down. The first one is many of us work with a number of UN agencies, including the International Labour Organization, UNHCR, OHCHR, and one of the things we appreciate about them is that as part of the UN, they're bound by the normative framework of rights. There's international conventions, ILO standards that they're all bound by as they do their work. ILO is a related agency, is a little bit different in your structure and your constitution of not necessarily being IOM, yeah. So I'm curious to hear from you how now with the increased responsibilities and things you're doing, how you'll ensure that IOM will promote a rights-based agenda in the work and programming that you do. And then my second question is, you talked a little bit about your work with UNHCR. I work a lot with the International Labour Organization. And again, we very much see them because of the ILO standards, the tripartite nature of ILO, the fact that civil society has an equal seat at the table there, that it's very important that they play a lead role in the UN system on labor migration. And so how you see IOM working within that, and then how you envision IOM also having a greater voice for civil society as you're a government-based membership organization. Thank you. Did I go too fast?
Do I have to repeat? The rights-based agenda, and how does it relate to where IOM is and is moving to, and how do the other organizations that have a hand into international migration, how will you relate to them? And
one needs to realize that in the migration field, we do not have an equivalent normative source that other agencies can build on, like UNHCR, for instance. They have the 51 Convention, the 67 New York Protocol, or like ILO, who has the Convention on the Rights of migrant workers, in spite of the fact that, as you know, it's not widely subscribed. But in the migration policy field, there is no equivalent normative vocation. So everything will depend much more on cooperation, international cooperation among member states, and international organization and member states. That's the key issue. Life is what it is. And definitely, if you see what has happened with the Global Compact, it's quite clear that there are no conditions for speaking about a normative role equivalent to the ones of other agencies. Having said that, we have quite a track record of cooperating with the civil society, because in fact we in regions like Syria or Cox's Bazar, or now more recently in Venezuela, we are UN agencies or UN-related agencies who operate through NGOs. In the case of Venezuela, it's 90-something NGOs. So we keep a very close relationship with NGOs, both in the field, but also at headquarters. And now that we are the coordinators of the UN Migration Network, we will have a broad consultation with the civil society on April 4 about how the civil society can cooperate with the UN Migration Network. And the composition of the steering committee of the fund that has been created under the UN Migration Network, a startup fund to deal with the implementation of the Global Compact. We think that, and we are discussing with ILO, with DESA, with other agencies, we think that in the steering committee of the fund there should be representatives of the civil society on a rotational basis. Because the civil society is very complex, as you know. I mean, ILO has a comparative advantage. They have employers and workers. Game over. Well, in migration fields, things are much more complicated.
all right, so we have the gentleman there on the second row, then the third row, and then the lady over there.
Good morning, thank you. I'm Bob Pava, I'm a retiree. I've met a few of you in the room. I was reflecting on some of your answers to questions, and first Anita's question about the Global Compact, and your reply that internal politics obviously had a large role in many of the actions of states that decided not to sign. And Kathleen's comment about information, working with better data, better information, and your affirmation that that's a priority for IOM to increase that. But taking it away from the community of people like many of us, and probably most of us in this room, who work or have worked in the migration field, or governments that have an obligation to read what's produced and to reflect on it and to understand what the reality is. What I was thinking of is more what we are seeing, and not only in the United States, but around the world, very hardening attitudes toward migration in general, largely based on, in many cases, the same internal politics, but also, frankly, not great flow of information. Feel-good stories about migration are not. That's not better to it. And I'm wondering if IOM is reflecting, looking to the future, on ways to address that side of the polity, if I can call it that, because the public's attitudes can also shape the politics. I think what we're seeing right now is the opposite. and I'd appreciate hearing your thoughts if you had a chance to think about that in these few short months. Thank you.
Well, the answer is very simple. Yes, we are thinking very much about that. But I'm in office for 5 months. Give me a break. I understand the anxiety of having answers to all the questions. But some questions take a little bit more time to be answered than others. The problem with it's here we are preaching to the converted, okay? The difficulty is how to reach the other camp. And the other camp is split into a minority that, in my view, is a lost case, because there are racist, xenophobic attitudes. But the vast majority of the skeptic or even the rejection camp of migration are people that have legitimate anxieties, reasonable doubts about their future, and sometimes, and that's the tricky issue, migration appears as the scapegoat of broader identitarian, cultural or social cultural problem that the most perfect migration policy would never be able to solve, because it goes very far beyond migration policy. So, one of the difficulties we have is that, to a large extent, the criticism towards the Global Compact was channeled through the social media. That is a tool of high polarization of the debates. People just read what is written by the ones that think alike the reader. And we need to break that kind of apartheid. And one of the ways of doing it, you mentioned it, is making much more available the stories, the real stories of real people with a human face about migration. But the channels and the tools to communicate, it will take some time before we fine-tune them. But we are working on that.
I think, to paraphrase Alcoholic Anonymous, we first have to come to terms with these issues within you, and I don't mean an individual, but each country, has to do that and has to acknowledge, that not everybody experiences migration the same way, and the polarization now has become so extreme, as Antonio mentioned with identitarianism, that we tend to simply double down on the things that we're comfortable with, and that does not create an opportunity for movement in the debate, because they double down, we double down. What's the sense? There is no conversation to be had. Right? No. Sorry, I keep an order in my head. You're third.
Thanks, Dimitri. Adam Hunter. I work with funders on migration questions, and my question was going to be pretty similar to the prior one. So let me ask maybe a more institutional one, reflecting on your time as commissioner, and now this current seat that you have as Director General. What's been the biggest surprise in terms of the change of perspective from that very European-centric to this intergovernmental service organization, now a UN agency with a potential rights mandate? What have been kind of the evolutionary steps for yourself in gaining perspective in that shift?
So go back, in other words, to reflecting on your previous job, several jobs previously, and today, and what has changed. Because you're now heading a global organization, however important the EU is, it is still a regional organization.
Well, even when I was in the European Commission, an important part of my work was to deal with international cooperation with other parties in the world, mainly Africa, okay? So the biggest difference, I always say this joke, saying when I got to the job, I thought that Africa would be my most relevant headache. And finally, I came out to find out that my biggest headache is Latin America. So, if you want to, that's a surprise for me. I was not expecting that the dimension of the situation in Latin America would make it my top priority in these first few months in office. Apart that, I knew that all the other crises that existed definitely, and the role that IOM played in that respect, and in relation to all other situations, I did not have too many surprises. But I've never been a Eurocentric European, I think. At least that's what I think about myself. Okay.
Thank
Can
you.
we have our last question, because I'm sorry I have to leave.
My
Last
name is
question.
Bonnie, and I'm from the UN Association of the USA. And I just wanted to ask, so our organization works to advocate and educate Americans about the work of the United Nations. To kind of, summarize all the points that we've discussed this morning, I'm wondering, what message do you think is most important for Americans to know about the IOM?
Well, I think that no matter the size of the country, migration requires international cooperation. And therefore, I think that historically speaking, IOM has been a creation of the US. Let's begin. So it's a tool that the United States have created, supported, and I think it is still a useful tool, or if you want, even more useful than in the past, because more needed. That does not mean that IOM does not need to change. Of course we are changing. Of course we need to guarantee that a highly decentralized organization is an organization that follows a number of standards and patterns, whether it is about implementation of human rights, for instance, which I know is an issue that the NGOs look closely scrutinizing as far as IOM is concerned, but also fraud prevention, risk mitigation, preventing the use of our support for evil ends, deviation of our support, because we operate in very unfriendly and insecure environments. But that's precisely the reason why the organization is very flexible. It's because we are sensitive to the realities of the ground, and we are capable to adapt our actions to the needs on the ground. And we need to make sure that that flexibility is not at the cost of our basic principles and values that are enshrined in our Constitution.
That's a great question and a great answer, but I will ask you one more question, which has a very short answer, and then we'll let you go.
Thank you.
What keeps you awake at night? Besides, maybe you don't sleep well because you travel all the time, but what keeps you awake,
Well, to be honest, I am a very good sleeper. So the great complaint of my wife, because she says that I snore.
Okay, this is a sensitive topic here.
But in fact, so I get to sleep very easily. But my key concern is that IOM has a budget of $1.8 billion US dollars, of which I told you I think 1.1 is for humanitarian assistance. 97% of IOM's budget is projectized, comes from projects. Projects usually have, in most cases, have 1 year duration, no more. It's not multi-year. So the sustainability of the organization and the capacity to plan is not fit for 1 year budgeting. So I think that IOM will have to have a conversation with these member states about that. Saying, listen, if we want to plan ahead, we cannot just be so dependent on yearly budgeting that can shift dramatically and then have huge implications in human capital. If the project ends, if it's not renovated, the people that we have been investing in training in that program are not used anymore. And that does not allow us to plan to say, okay, let's have a 3 years approach to a specific situation. We cannot, because we are very much yearly budgetized. So it does not keep me awake at night, as I said, but if I was a normal person, you would keep me awake at night.
And I know you cannot answer the real question, which is what's the next crisis that we're not thinking about? In your position, maybe you shouldn't give an answer to that.
I give a side answer.
Okay.
For instance, I think that I'm very concerned with the situation of an Ebola pandemic in the DRC. And we need to be prepared that health issues will become each time more and more relevant in the impact with the populations. And we need to monitor that much better than we have done in the past, with their impacts in movement of people. Because when people move, the pandemics move with them. So it's a very complex situation. We had Ebola in West Africa. Now we have in Kivu province, in a very difficult environment where there are very different kinds of groups or armed groups operating.
Well, please, let's thank Director General of the IOM.